Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I want to talk to you about 3 very different books I've read recently, all by trans authors. So I read these books for the Trans Girl April event that took place throughout April, and I went into it not really knowing what to expect, I think. But when I look back at books I've read in the past, I've read very, very few books by trans authors. In fact, I can only think of one off the top of my head, which was All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders, which is excellent. So it's definitely a gap in my reading, and that's why I really welcome events like this, because they challenge me to read books that I wouldn't necessarily have read otherwise. And certainly of these 3 books, one of the books is a book I may have read, the other 2 I don't think I would have read, and I got something out of all of them. I enjoyed all of them a great deal. But what I would say is they were all very, very different. So you might think, going into an event like this where you are reading books by authors who have something really significant in common, in this case being trans, that there would be, overwhelming similarities between the books. And I didn't find that at all. I found these books to be entirely different from each other. Clearly they all touched on the trans experience, but they were told in very different ways. They had very different stories, and I took something different from each of them. But I enjoyed all 3 of them, and I would recommend all 3 of them to anyone out there. Now, one of these books is a book that I may have read anyway. So that's a book called Transmuted by an author called Eve Harms, which is part of the Rewind or Die series of short horror books that you can get on Kindle. And I've read a couple of other books in that series before, so they're all unrelated to each other, but they all have a kind of slightly trashy 80s video store kind of a vibe to them. So Transmuted by Eve Harms definitely fell into that category. The other 2 books I read were this one, Felix Ever After by Kacen Callender, and the other one was a book called Any Other City by an author called Hazel Plante. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to talk briefly about each of the 3 books, what they were about, what I particularly liked about them, and then do kind of a bit of a summing up at the end. So let's start with the Eve Harms book. So this is a really fun, quite graphic, but just thoroughly entertaining horror novella. So it's about a trans woman who's a gamer. So she does game streams and things like that to make money, and she saved up the money she needs for feminization surgery to complete her transition. But her dad's terminally ill, and she ends up giving the money to him for his treatment. She then gets on Instagram gets an advert for this shady sounding doctor who's offering to do the surgery she needs very cheaply, and she goes to him, and he's like a kind of mad scientist character. And I won't spoil the book, but from there it becomes much more of a traditional kind of horror type story. And as I said, it did feel at times a lot like a kind of direct-to-video 80s horror story. There's body horror, there's kind of gross transformation type stuff, there's a huge monster that appears in it, and there's this evil mad scientist character. But it was really, really entertaining, and it went to places I wasn't expecting at all. Felix Ever After couldn't be more different, really. So this is a YA book about a young trans man who's an artist. So he's at art school, and he is not necessarily struggling with his identity, but struggling a bit with his place in the world and with relationships and things like that. And the book starts with somebody at the college he's at putting up pictures of him in a gallery from before he transitioned, which is something that's very, very hurtful to him. And a lot of the book is taken up with him trying to find out who did that. So there's kind of a central mystery running through it, but also a lot of relationship stuff. And ultimately, it's a romance, and a really sweet and touching romance at that. So set in New York, it's got a real kind of New York vibe to it, and it felt like a very modern, current kind of book. So I felt quite cool reading this book in terms of, reading about young art students hanging out in New York, going to parties and stuff like that. So me, boring old fart that I am, quite enjoyed that side of it. And it's a beautifully presented book as well. So it's got this lovely kind of flowers on the side as well. So again, a really a very different book from the Eve Harms book, but really, really enjoyable and quite sweet. The third book then was Any Other City by Hazel Plante, which came out in April, so it came out on the 18th of April. And I read it actually on release day, so I'd kind of been waiting for it to come out because it was one of the kind of group reads for their Trans Girl April event. So as soon as it came out, I bought it and happened to not be reading anything, so I started reading it. And it was fantastic. So I think it was my favourite of the three. So it's about a trans woman who's a rock star, and the book is told very much in two halves. So side A and side B, like a record album. So side A, it takes place in the past. So before she was a rock star and before she transitioned. So very much leading up to her transition, and her kind of understanding things about her identity through contacts she has with trans people and some trans artists and musicians in particular. And then the second half of the book takes place after she's transitioned, after she's become a rock star, after she's become hugely successful, and it's kind of about her trying to deal with a failed relationship, but also just trying to deal with the pressures of fame and things like that. So this one read to me very much like a kind of rock and roll story. It's that kind of, almost like that kind of rags to riches story where you see the path of a character's life changing throughout the course of the book, and them as a person changing as they get success and adopt a new identity. And when you think about rock stars, they are often people who have a persona that they project when they're on stage. And that definitely came across in this book as well. What I would say, one thing about this book that definitely made it very different from Felix Ever After, for example, is it's very, very rude at times. So there's one scene that takes place in a bar, which I think is one of the most sexually explicit things I've read for a long time. It did make me blush a bit. But yeah, it's a really, really entertaining book and really absorbing in terms of. It's that kind of book that doesn't necessarily have a strong plot running through it, but you just feel completely immersed in the central character's life, and you feel like you're experiencing the things that happen to them with them, and that's a wonderful thing to put yourself in someone else's shoes, for the course of a book. I really, really enjoyed that. So there were three very different books. So a piece of, I guess you'd call it literary fiction in Any Other City, a YA book in Felix Ever After, and a genre book that very strongly plays on the tropes of its genre in Transmuted. But all really interesting and all clearly reflect on the trans experience to different degrees and in different ways. And I was really pleased to have read, for one of the books to be about a trans man rather than a trans woman. But it was interesting for me, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this event was to read to read and understand the trans experience, because it's something that feels very much outside of my own experience. I've never suffered from gender dysphoria or anything like that, so I didn't. I have very limited understanding of it, and I feel like through reading these books, I've improved my understanding, which has got to be a good thing. So I found all three of the books absolutely fascinating, and whilst I've said there were differences, I think the thing that unites them clearly is the fact that all three of them are written by trans people. But beyond that, the thing that I found in all three of them was that they're just about the struggles of life, the struggles of trying to figure out who you are, particularly in Felix Ever After and in Any Other City. So that question of identity that all of us struggle with, but that is something that is more challenging, I suppose, for trans people because their identity and discovering their identity and embracing their true identity involves an external difference which can be judged by other people. So when you think about any teenager goes through a period of self-discovery, and I certainly did as a teenager. I went through a goth phase where I wrote all over my jeans and painted some of my dad's old work boots purple, and much to his chagrin. But all of us go through that, and we end up finding our identities. And I think that one of the things that this book made clear to me, these books made clear to me, not that it needed to be made clear because it's obvious, but that for trans people that's a more it's a bigger deal because of the fact that they are so hugely judged by large portions of society, and not just judged but discriminated against, maligned. There are terrible laws being passed all over the world that heavily discriminate against trans people. We're seeing it in the UK at the moment, where the Scottish Parliament passed a gender recognition bill where people could legally change their gender easily, and the British Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, is blocking that, which I think is a terrible thing. So yeah, all three books really interesting. I feel that reading all three of them has improved my understanding, but I'm really glad that I read all three of them rather than just one. I think having that variety and having those different styles of stories and different voices was helpful. Was helpful in me building up that overall picture, because one trans person's experience of the world is not going to be the same as another's. So getting a bit of variety, I think, was helpful for me. Okay, time for a random book from the shelf. So today's book is by an author who's fairly recently, I think, come out as non-binary. That's Eric LaRocca. This book is You've Lost a Lot of Blood, which I have reviewed on the channel, which is a really interesting body horror story. Reminded me a lot of David Cronenberg's films like Videodrome and Existenz. So yeah, really interesting book. I had a great time with it, and it's told in a really interesting way as well. So I hope you found that interesting. Do let me know if you read anything for Trans Girl April and what you took from it. If you've got any particular recommendations for me, other books that I might enjoy by trans authors. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.